Hi guys, and welcome to part 1 of the Woodpecker tutorial. I have chosen this reference from Pixabay, so if you're wanting to post on social media or anything like that, make sure that you credit Pixabay if you're posting it or anything like that. This is I don't know, I'm not sure if it's a lesser spotted or a greater spotted woodpecker. They're found here in the UK. He's got this lovely kind of black and white and kind of almost creamy with a few tinges of brown feathers, and then on the underbelly down here, you can't see it at the moment because I've zoomed right in so you can see his lovely face. He's got this really lovely red belly. I've also chosen to add in some of the bark from the reference photo on the tree. That's going to be a little bit of a tricky texture, but we're going to be tackling the bird first because he's on the more left hand side of the page than the bark here. So we're going to be working across, well actually we're going to be working on the bird and then we're going to be working on the bark. I've also lined so I get a nice straight edge down this side here with some Scotch magic tape. So we get a nice line so that we can frame it nicely or compose it nicely in a frame or anything like that. And then at the top here, I'm not going to like line off the top so it's like boxed in. I'm going to fade out the top and the bottom slightly just to give it a little bit more of a kind of flowing look. I feel like sometimes when you add tape onto the bottom and you really box something in, it just makes it look a little bit more static. So I'm just going to leave the tops and the bottom bits of the bark. I'm gonna like fade it out rather than having a straight line, and then that's where it stops. So we're going to start with the face of the woodpecker. We're going to start with the eye and then work on the beak and then work our way down. The feathers are quite uncomplicated, they're just dark and white or light feathers, so there's not too many kind of colour variations like in other tutorials that I've done for you guys, so it's going to be pretty straightforward. We're going to be mainly using our kind of neutral tones, our browns, so I've already pre-sharpened the walnut brown, the dark sepia, the nougat, and I've also got some dark indigo there as well because we've got a lot of blue tones in the dark feathers. We're also going to be using obviously our base colours of warm grey 1 and warm grey 2 and ivory for those lighter toned feathers as well. But to begin with, what we're going to do is add in the eye of the woodpecker using some dark sepia. So you can see I've got a really nice sharp point on my pencil here. I know this is slightly out of focus because I've really focused in on the actual woodpecker and the actual drawing. So I'm going to use the dark sepia pencil. I've already pre-outlined the eye, as you can see. I've kind of added in the outside of where the highlight's going to be and the actual outside of the eye. So the technique we're going to use for this is just using a light pressure first of all, just to add around the outside of the eye, just to go around over the top of that graphite, and then I'm going to switch to using the walnut brown to add in the colour of the eye, and we're going to use a little bit of a negative space method around the highlight first of all. So what we want to do first is use a light pressure on the dark sepia, but we're also going to use a really light hand so that we can make sure that the shape is perfect before we go in with the heavier pressure on the pencil. So the line drawing that I've done is just slightly more squashed than the reference and what I would like the eye to be. So I'm just making it a little bit rounder. I'm just making sure that shape's in. I'm pretty happy with how that is. So I've kind of made two lines here, one outer line where we've got I never know what it is that is actually around the outside of a bird eye. I should really look it up, but they've kind of got this lip of, it's like an eyelid I suppose, but it doesn't have the eyelashes like a human or animal eyelid. I'm just gonna kind of making two lines, so outlining the very edge of that kind of eyelidy area and then going in slightly further towards the middle of the eye and adding in a line for the actual eyeball. This is all very small and delicate as well, so this is why we need a really nice sharp pencil. I'm going to go in with a firmer pressure, or as firm a pressure as I can, to get these areas all in. So going into the line that is more towards the centre of the eye rather than the outer line, first of all. So we've got that nice outline there. I'm pretty happy with how that is looking. Before I go and add some some walnut brown in there, I am just going to add a very light layer of the warm grey one to the outside of this area. I'm just going to use a little bit of a circular motion with the pencil, and that's just so that we can build up that kind of eyelid area outside there. I'm also just going to overlap that with some of the ivory just to give it a little bit of warmth as well, and 2 layers of this lighter tone won't hurt either. It's going to give it a really nice base to work on. So I'm just swapping to the walnut brown, and I'm going to add the pupil area and the iris, and I'm going to use, as I say, a little bit of a negative space method to add in the highlights. So by that I mean I'm not going to add any colour to the lighter parts of this. So I'm just going in to the left hand side first of all, where we've got the highlight, adding a little bit in there, and then coming into the right hand side. I'm using a circular motion as well to fill in that colour. So it's quite a big highlight on this woodpecker eye. So just going to go in with a firmer pressure. I'm going to switch back to the dark sepia and add slightly darker areas. So mainly kind of this area in the highlight here kind of acting like the pupil, I suppose. I'm also going to add some dark red over the top of the walnut brown to give a little bit of warmth to the eye colour, which is perfect. And then for the actual highlight area itself, I'm going to use a really light layer of some dark indigo on the kind of right hand side of the highlight area in there. And then onto the left hand side I'm going to use the scarlet red to give a little bit of a red tone to the highlight. And then into that I'm going to use my white pencil to help to blend and lighten those tones. And then I can go into the darker areas again. I'm using the dark indigo this time to add in these dark areas, because overlaying this on the walnut brown will give a really nice dark tone as well. I'm just going back into that highlight with the dark indigo and just darkening up that right side. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the eye. It's not got too much detail in it, but we've done the kind of best we can with the detail that we can add in there. And then going to take the dark sepia again, and I'm just going to gently work around the outside of the eye, but leaving a little bit of a gap of that lighter colour that I added in. And this is going to help to form the sort of eyelid area of the woodpecker. So just leaving a little tiny bit of a gap, using a light pressure with the dark sepia, and then I'm just going to use a slightly heavier pressure, and I'm going to use little dots, try and put little dots around the outside. I'm just adding in any sort of darker details that I can see around the outside of the eye as well. We can start to form a little bit of the feathers that kind of come down around the eye in this lighter section as well. So adding those in. Okay. Pretty happy with how that eye area is looking. If we need to add any kind of lighter areas in, or denote any kind of really sparkliness, we can use the white gel pen, or you can try and use a white pencil, whichever you prefer. I like to use the white gel pen. I'm just going to add a few little dots into the eye where we've got some really kind of brighter highlights. Once this is dried, I'm going to go in and knock it back with a layer of coloured pencil over the top, but you need to make sure that it's really dry before you go and do that, otherwise your coloured pencil is just going to pick up the kind of pigment or the ink that the jelly roll pen has left down. So we need to let that dry, so it's going to look a little bit odd for the moment, but that's fine. What we're going to do in the meantime is add down the lighter feathers, so he's kind of got this really light mask around his eyes. We're going to add that in, and we're going to layer a combination of the ivory and the warm grey one. I'm going to put down the ivory first this time, and I'm just going to erase the graphite ever so slightly, because I don't want any of this graphite showing in or coming over into the lighter colours, because sometimes your pencils can pick up the graphite and it can transfer it into lighter areas. So I am just erasing the graphite a little bit there. So with this layer, I'm just going to start here. This little section of feathers we've got coming up towards the crown of the head, and then the feathers kind of rotate. I'm also going slightly over into the darker areas with this as well, so that we can get a really nice smooth transition between the areas. And then as we come around the eye, they kind of swoop round and come towards the back of the head. So we want to make sure that we follow those directions so that we can get a nice lay down of those feathers. Again, just going ever so slightly over into the darker areas as well with this. So over that graphite line. You can see it's got a really nice light covering there. So I'm taking the warm grey one now, and I'm just going to use this pencil more on the side slightly. And I'm just going to lightly add this over the top. It's just going to help to add a few of those greyer tones into the feathers, and using the pencil on the side and kind of shading in the direction of the feathers is also just going to help to form that feather pattern. These are really kind of soft downy feathers, and I find that when you shade on the side like this, this helps to really mimic that soft downiness without having to go in and add too many details, especially as you start to add more layers as well. Okay, I'm leaving this part free of any grey because we've got a lot of kind of orange tones in this section. So now what we can do is take some, I think we're going to use the nougat just really softly, maybe even some warm grey 3. Yeah, we'll use the warm grey 3 here, so we can start to I'm just going to use kind of point of the pencil, and I'm just going to start to add in very small lines where I can see the darker tones within this patch of cream downy feathers. And then I'm also just going to overlay some nougat. The pencil's really sharp on the nougat, so I don't need to push or apply barely any pressure in order to add that colour down, which is really nice. So we're going to do a combination of the Warm Grey 3 and the nougat. I also find that sometimes it's really helpful to work in the opposite direction of the feathers, so working backwards into the feathers as well as forwards, because then you get that really nice overlay, and it just tends to look a little bit more natural if you end up creating your feathers that way. So taking the nougat, just going to add a few little lines and a little bit of shading as well. And we can start to really judge if we need to make this any darker when we've added in the darker areas surrounding as well. So we might find that we need to come back in here and darken up this white space. I always find that I need to come in and darken up whiter areas. We can see all of the colours are just really nice and gentle. Nothing's too harsh or anything like that. Just nice soft colours. So this similar story is what going to happen in the front here. So I'm going to switch to using some brown ochre, and I'm also going to use some green gold and also lace in a little bit of the scarlet red. I'm just going to give this a quick sharpen because I want a nice sharp point to get some really good colour lay down and to make sure that I really get some fine line details in there. My pencil sharpener's got very squeaky lately. So I'm going to take the brown ochre and we're going to layer this really gently to begin with around here, so starting kind of with this dark patches, so increasing the pressure slightly so we can get a better lay down of the colour. Introducing a little bit of the green gold as well, and then putting down some of the scarlet red in there. Try and create a nice orange tone. You can also grab out some terracotta or some, what's another one, maybe some sanguine or something like that if you're finding it difficult to get this colour to match exact. I'm not too worried about matching the colour exact. I'm gonna try and make sure I stick to this palette, and by using the brown ochre and then putting the scarlet red over the top. The scarlet red is what we're going to be using for the belly section right down here, so introducing the scarlet red up here and trying to create our own orange tone will kind of really marry those two areas together once they're both in there. It just makes it a really nice cohesive colour palette as well. You can see I've not got too many colours that I've selected to be in this woodpecker tutorial, and I really like to work like this because then it just makes you blend your colours and it just helps the drawing, I think, look quite seamless. And by introducing a bunch of different colours, sometimes things can look a little bit muddy, whereas if you've just got a few, you're learning how to, one, use those colours to build certain areas, and you're not going to end up with too muddy areas by introducing too many colours. I'm just going to take the dark indigo and just go over those little things with the jelly roll pen. And that's in there, and they're nicely toned down, but you can just about see them still kind of poking their heads through a little bit. I'm going to travel down the beak now, so we do have some really light downy feathers here, which I'm just going to add in first. Once again, I want to make sure that I erase the graphite outline, especially as this is on the edge, because these are going to be really nice and fine. I'm going to give my ivory pencil a sharpen as well, so we can get some really nice fine points on this section here where we've got some fluffy feathers coming around the beak. So using this first again, I'm just going to come off of the sort of beak area here with that. So we've got a few feathers that kind of come up into the beak there. And then the rest of the feathers kind of fall down and around the neck. So making sure I bring those down. And once again, kind of going over the graphite lines and into the darker areas to help get a nice smooth transition. Switching back to the warm grey one. And we can start to add in a few little lines with the warm grey one coming off as well, so we get a nice mixture of those different colours. And again, kind of using the pencil, holding it a little bit more parallel to the paper and using it to get some shading in. And using the warm grey 3 and the nougat, this is a little bit more on the brown side, so we can go in with a little bit more of a firmer pressure, I think, with the nougat on this little section here. So I'm just using the warm grey 3 first of all. And then switching to the nougat. And there's also a few kind of more orangey vibes going on with these feathers, so I'm going to introduce a little bit of the brown ochre as well into there. So picking up the brown ochre and introducing a little bit more of those warmer tones. So I'm just making very small lines and working in the direction of the feathers. So a very slightly darker section, and then I'm just going to take the nougat and I'm just going to make little kind of lines here and there to give this kind of almost mottled appearance, where we do have some lighter tones showing through in between some of these darker ones on the neck here. So I'm using the pencil and making lines and keeping them really close together. to create a darker section. It's going to come off of the neck with a few of those as well. And go back in with the brown ochre. This time just kind of glazing and shading it down over the top. There we go. So now we can add the beak in. So the beak has just grey tones mixed with a little bit of blue. So we're going to use the cold grey 2. We're going to use the warm grey 1 as a base, add the cold grey 2, and then just add very, very light layers of the dark indigo over the top. So we'll put down our warm grey 1 first of all, but we want to make sure that we get rid of the graphite here. I also need to make the beak a little tiny bit slimmer, I think. Let's take in the warm grey 1. Just going to fill the area where the beak was. I'm going to come right back into the darker feathers as well with that, and then straight away I'm going to overlay some of the cold grey 2. I'm going to also blend this with a white pencil. I want to make sure that this is nice and smooth, and I want to desaturate the colours a little bit here. So using the white pencil, this is really going to help to smooth everything out, and it will knock back those colours. It also makes it a little bit more difficult to add colour over the top, because especially with this Holbein soft white that I'm using, it really does put a waxy coating down, so it is a little bit more difficult to kind of put down pencils over the top. I find it easiest to add pencils over the top like this when you do have a nice sharp point. So I'm going to take the dark indigo and I'm going to use it on the side slightly to add a very subtle hint of blue. And again, I can smooth this out with the white pencil, and it's also going to help to lighten the blue tone. So you can see I've just very subtly added a blue tone down there. Add in the white once again. It's just very, very subtly shifted to blue. I'm going to take the dark sepia, which is the main colour we're going to use to add the details and the shading. There's a central line where you can see the partition in the beak, but I'm going to add the darker colour into the tip of the beak first of all, so there's a really dark end to the tip of the beak. So I'm going to add that in. So I'm using a harder pressure right where I can see we've got the darker lines at the beak here, and then really lifting the pencil off the paper to get a very subtle shade of the dark sepia down. So firmer pressure for the darker areas, and then just lift for the lighter areas. I'm just starting to come back and add this partition in the beak as well. And again, where there's slightly darker, more obvious areas of that partition, I'm just going in and adding a firmer pressure. And then towards the outside of that line, I'm just going to use a really light pressure on the dark sepia and build up the layers to build up some shading. The bottom of the beak is the lightest here, so I want to make sure that I keep that really nice and light. I'm also going to introduce a little bit more of the dark indigo for a little bit more of a blue tone. And then to the top of the beak, just doing exactly the same. Just bringing back any shading and adding in any kind of distinguishable lines that I can see. I'm going to use the dark indigo to help with the partition and the dark tones of the beak as well. To help to really bring out that lightness in the beak, we need to add the darker tones around here. So I'm going to use some of the Warm Grey 3 to just add in the darker feathers around the beak here. So I'm using quite a hard pressure because we've got a very dark area of feather, and on top of this I'm going to also add some of the dark indigo. Just going to gently add some of this down. And then some dark sepia. And this time using some light lines and increasing the pressure to really get the dark tone in there. And then there's a few kind of sporadic darker feathers overlapping as well. Add in some dark walnut brown in there as well, just to increase the variety of tones. And then working back towards here, you can see just a little bit more of the beak, so I'm just going to add in a layer of the Warm Grey 3 there. I'm coming all the way back actually and start to add in this darker patch in the feathers. I'm going to add in a little bit of the dark indigo. Kind of following the direction of the feathers as well. You can really start to see the darker feathers here. I'm going to add a layer of the walnut brown over the top of that as well to help to create a little bit more of a more natural dark tone first of all. And I'm going to make sure that I bring the walnut brown with the sharp point down into these lighter feathers so we get a nice transition of those tones. And also just by bringing in a few kind of little random lines, it helps to make the area look a little bit more natural, like the feathers are really overlapping. Just going to use the cold grey, do a little bit of blending through the beak area before coming in with the dark sepia. I'm using a firm pressure and really darkening this up here. And this time, just coming into the lighter feathers once again. Making sure I blend the feathers into the beak as well. You can bring that central line of the beak right the way back, and then just start to add in a few kind of darker details overlapping in there, using some of the dark indigo as well. Oop. So only trouble when you start to increase the pressure is that you do start to break some of the points on your pencil. Now that I've got a little bit of that darker tone in, I can go in to the lighter tone above. Just to help that transition, I'm going to add this brown ochre just where the feathers are starting to really come into that darker patch there. I'm also going to introduce a little tiny bit of the walnut brown into the lower half of the feathers on the neck to help to darken them, just a very, very small amount. Okay, so our beak is all in nicely, and we've started these feathers and everything here, so we're just going to continue. There's a little bit of a lighter feather back here which I'm going to add in first, and I'm just going to add the lighter feathers around this darker kind of, it looks like it's wearing a little helmet with some little like a handlebar moustache kind of thing. So I'm going to add in all of the lighter areas surrounding, just following that same process of putting down the ivory and those lighter colours first of all, and then I'm going to continue adding in the darker colours like we've just added in. So let's add in the lighter areas. So I'm going to just add in this little bit on the back here. So we'll add in that. Just stretching down the back a little bit there. And again, just kind of going to bring the base layer of the ivory into the areas of the darker colour a little bit, so we can get that good overlay. And then we've also got the base to come around this bit just here, and I've got all of this lovely downy front to do as well, which I'm really looking forward to. That's going to be a really nice simple process to add all of that in. So just adding in this for the time being, and then going in with the warm grey one. This area on the chest area is a little bit more warmer in tone, so we might not need to add too much of the warm grey one into this bit here. But the area on the back has a little bit more of a cooler tone, so I'm going to add the grey over the top on the back here. A little bit there. And I'm going to add a little bit of the warm grey too. Just going to add a few little lines just to add a small amount of detail onto this section. Really make sure we overlap into that darker area as well. And then on the front here I'm going to use the warm grey too, because it's got that slightly warmer tone to it. Just make sure we kind of add in this area where we've got the overlap. And then that's it. Going to use the nougat to add in a few little brown details. So I'm just using the point of the pencil and adding in a few little details through there. Coming through the chest as well with the nougat. Okay, that should be enough that we can add all of the darker areas surrounding. So with the darker areas, I'm going to put down a base layer of the cold grey too. I'm not going to bother with erasing the graphite in these areas. I'm just going to add this base layer pretty much all over here. So I do want to make sure that I follow the direction of the feathers. So over the head they are kind of coming up and over, and then on this kind of, I don't know, the cheeky kind of neck area, they're kind of just coming down towards the wing here. So I do want to make sure that I do add those in the correct direction. This cold grey will also blend really nicely into the lighter tone, so it's a really nice base to put down. I am going in with a slightly heavier pressure so that we can distinguish the areas as well, because I don't want them to blend in too much that we can't then distinguish the darker sections from the lighter sections. Once we get this in around the eye, he'll start to look a lot more like a woodpecker, or just a bird in general. Hopefully you can see the distinction between the dark area and the light area in there. I'm going to add a very, very light layer of the Indanthrene blue. I'm going to use the pencil on the side slightly. And just add a little bit of a blue tone. Gonna add walnut brown on top as well, so we get that nice kind of natural brown tone. Making sure I come up into the whiter areas as well, going over where I've added that kind of overlap. Just going to add the black in here as well, so we can add all of that area at once. The feathers just kind of transition and turn slightly towards the right hand side down here as well. Okay, I'm going to get a little bit of the stronger blue on the head. Really like how that tone is coming out. And I'll add that walnut brown over the top. So we want to be careful because we do have quite a nice blue tone, so I am going to use a lighter pressure when adding the walnut brown sort of on the top of the head here, because we do have a little bit of light reflection and it is quite blue in tone. So what I'll do is add the walnut brown to get a nice darker base, but then go back over with the blue to make it appear even bluer. Let's add, we can add a heavy pressure around the eye. This bit's nice and dark. So I'm kind of coming backwards against the grain of the feathers a little bit here. And then softening it out and blending it into more of a blue tone. In fact, I may need to grab out a different colour for the top part here, because it's got a slightly bit more of a, like a greeny tint to it, and I want to try and mimic that as best as possible, so I will go and get another colour to add to our list. Just I want to try and create that as best as possible. I'm just going in with the brown where I can see the darker, or darkest areas, or the blackest areas I suppose. It's really dark. And around here where the feathers are really overlapping, I'm switching my technique to using more of a line, and let me demonstrate on the back here. So I'm kind of like adding little lines like this and grouping them quite close together and varying the length so we get a nice kind of grouping of colour. It's just going to help when we're blending into these lighter areas as well by doing that, and that also helps to darken the colour because we're grouping the pencil strokes together on top of one another, so you're kind of layering and you're grouping them really close together, and it's going to help to build darker colour. And then where we do have slight variations in the tone, where you do have lighter areas and darker areas, by building the feathers in that way, by adding those lines and grouping them together, where you do have slightly darker variations in the feathers, you can group your lines really close together, and then when they do get a little bit more lighter, you can space your lines a little bit further apart, and it just helps to give that feather texture as well as that saturation of colour as well, so you're kind of doing two things at once. I love building darker tones like this. I do find white and black tones some of the easiest to try and mimic. I know a lot of people do struggle with these, but they are one of my favourites. Now this looks a little bit rough at the moment, but we will neaten it up. We'll come back in with the dark sepia. As I said, I do want to come in with a slightly different tone for the feathers. These darker ones anyway. But that's a pretty good job on the dark feathers for the time being. So I'm going to go and grab that other colour, and then we'll add that down and then start to go over with some dark sepia. So I've picked out the Helio Turquoise. I'm going to add it to the list. It'll be in the materials for you guys anyway. This is going to be, I've just kind of swatched it out a little bit. This is going to be the kind of colour that we're going to add over the top. So let's add this in. This is a perfect colour here. Just going to pretty much add this all over. And on this lighter section on top of the head here, I will be using the white pencil to help smooth it out, and then we can add a few details. So paired with the Indanthrene blue, it actually makes a really nice combination of these two colours. I'm just going to add this pretty much all over on top of the walnut brown, and you can see it makes a really nice tone. I'm really enjoying that. Okay. So on top of the head, I'm going to blend with the white pencil. You can already see how nice and light that's looking in comparison to the other areas. But I will just give it, I'm not going to give it a thingy all over. I'm just going to use some lines and bring it over the top. I'm going to go right to the edge as well, so we get a nice smooth edge. You can see it's really nice and light there now. So then I'm going to use the dark indigo, and we can start to add in a few little details. I'm using the sharp point of the dark indigo to come from this darker area into the light patches of the feathers, using the very sharp point to create a little bit of an overlap. Just want them to look really nice and fluffy on the edge there. So just starting at the top of the head and adding in some slightly darker lines and details. I can use the dark sepia to really darken up these bits here. Around the back of the head, so we've got this much lighter section here, which is perfect. I'm just going to alter the shape ever so slightly by bringing in a little bit more of the dark indigo into that lighter section. Come back in with some dark sepia on top. And then also into and around the eye, we can start to add a few tiny little details. So I'm just going to come through the lighter feathers with a few strokes of the dark sepia, just to give the feathers a little bit of texture, and it's also going to help to blend these areas together a little bit more. So I'm just really coming in and kind of darkening up this eye as well. Coming into the beak and darkening that up too. I'm going to use a little bit of the Helio turquoise on the beak. A little bit there. So just bringing in, just coming round now with the dark indigo on these darker parts. I'm really increasing the pressure on the pencil, and I'm really kind of overlapping into these white areas as well. And then bringing in the dark sepia for the real kind of darkest areas. Coming back in with a little bit more helio turquoise. Okay, so I'm going to use a little bit of the nougat to come in and add a little bit of texture and detailing to some of these lighter sections. So on the edge of the dark area to the lighter area, I'm just coming in and adding in a little bit more texture through there. I'm just bringing in some lines and a few details to the feathers there. I'm going to add a little bit more red to this section on his beak and in his face, and I'm also just going to use a little bit of the red to tone some of these feathers around the eye as well, just through there and onto the neck a little bit as well. Here we go. So we've got our lovely woodpecker head. You can really start to see the woodpecker now rather than just a bald bird. So what we'll do now is work our way down. So I'll move up the piece so you can see a little bit more of the wing and everything. What we'll work on is we've got some dark feathers and then some lighter feathers in the wing and everything here, and a little bit of some separation and some toning that will need to go on down in the wing here as well. So we'll work on a little section of the wing and then we'll work on the full kind of chest, like white area of him there.